Hello everyone, John Drummond here, host of the TNT Show. That's The Nation Talks, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on Indy Live. And this Wednesday at 7 p.m, The Nation talks to Ged O'Brien. And Ged is going to tell us all about the origins of Scottish football, the passing game, how Scotland led the world, created world football as we know. And he's going to tell us all about Andrew Watson. Who is Andrew Watson? Only the world's first black footballer who was capped 3 times for Scotland. Don't miss it, 7 p.m, Wednesday. See you then.
Hi, Dr. Dave here. Join me for the Dr. Dave Show, Wednesday night, 9 o'clock, with repeats early Friday morning and 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Music, views, your requests and your comments. A great bit of fun and banter. Join me on indylive.radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackmannanshire Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on Indy Live Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. Be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at Indy Live Radio.
Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on Indy Live Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on Indy Live Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, this is Marley and I'm here to tell you a bit about Daytime Live Show, which goes out Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays on Indy Live Radio at 11:30 for a couple of hours. So I present the programme along with Val, and we're there with a variety of guests to chat to each day. Now, at the moment, Wednesday's show is a catch-up edition. It's not live. What we do is we rebroadcast some of the more recent interviews. So we hope we enjoy all of those. Be there at 11:30 on Indy Live Radio for the news you don't hear elsewhere, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, James E here from the Saturday Show on indylive.radio. We play a wide selection and wide genre of music for your entertainment. We're on Saturday mornings from 10 till 1 p.m. Remember, join us on indylive.radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
You can watch this again, maybe part of it. It's Independence Live, yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find it.
No Westminster. No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But before I'll be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, one more. Oh, freedom over me. But before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Hello, good evening and welcome to the TNT Show, The Nation Talks. It's been another great day for British democracy. We learned that, according to polling, nearly 50% of the folks down south would prefer an independent state. Meanwhile, in other news, the UK government continues to spew public money on contracts to friends and associates, immune from scrutiny or transparency for that matter. You can read all about this and much more in my Constitution column on Sunday in the Sunday National. And by the way, breaking news. Failing Grayling, the man who bought ships for a ferry that didn't exist, has failed in a rigged election to become chair of the ISC committee at Westminster. How you fail to get a rigged post? Well, only Failing Grayling can achieve that. Hi, my name is John Drummond. I'm your host for the next 60, I guarantee you, exciting minutes. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest tonight, and I'm really excited that he's able to join us. Stay tuned for his amazing and astonishing account of football in Scotland. And it's not what you think. But first, a few words about TNT. TNT, of course, is The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. You can call us. You'll see the details on the screen. You can write to me on email, john@cleash.com. And you can text on 07507 248 856. We take questions as we go through. This is live. This is 60 minutes live. And now to our guest. Tonight, the nation talks to Ged O'Brien. Born in Southampton, Ged, I kid you not, has forgotten more about Scottish football than most people actually know. Ged joins us tonight from Glasgow. How are you, Ged? How are you coping with the pandemic?
John, I'm fine, and the pandemic has been good to me because I'm sat here in the man cave and I've spent the last 2 months researching as much as I can about the game that we all love.
Excellent, excellent. Now, tell us a bit about your background. I mentioned that you were born in Southampton, Ged, and I gather your father was a steeplejack.
Yeah, my father is one of those people, I guess, in the mid 20th century that turned his hand to anything to get a job. So he was a fairground boxer. He started out in Ireland as a farmer, but of course with six boys and 3 girls, I'm afraid 5 boys had to leave. He ended up digging the roads. Some chunk of the M1 north of the Watford Gap is down to him and his boys, but he ended up down in Southampton building the power station up Marchwood, just outside Southampton, which is how I came to be born in a wee terraced house in Milton Road, which was at the other end of the road to Southampton Football Club, which really is where we started.
So, and he was a Southampton fan?
Well, he was a mad sports fan, and he followed Cork around, both the hurling team and the Gaelic football team. And he'd do a half shift on a Saturday, and as he came by on his bicycle, the then 3rd Division Southampton would have the gates open, as they did in the days of yore for the last 20 minutes. So he stopped in to look at this strange sport that this English team were playing, and he was hooked. And then we all came along, and we were hooked. So the O'Brien tribe of myself and him and my 4 sisters would troop down to the ground to watch absolutely every single type of match that the Dell had.
Yeah, and you've been mad about football ever since, I take it.
Well, yes, but your listeners should know I'm not the sort of guy that's going to tell you who played left back in the 1903 Scottish Cup final, because it's a fact which is of extremely little relevance, very boring. You can find plenty of intriguing people out there who will tell you this, and it tells you nothing. I'm more interested in what football tells us about the world in which we live.
We'll come on to that in a second, but I think you mentioned to me that your wish at one time, and maybe still persists, you wanted to be a museum curator.
Well, I have no idea how I got onto this, because I remember coming back from swimming with my troop of young guys, all my wee pals from the street, and going into Southampton Art Gallery. And even at my sort of age of 10, I can remember the fear in the museum security guard's eyes as this horde of scruff bags burst through the door. I have no idea why I fell in love with paintings and objects, and I just wanted to work in museums, and I did. And I ended up, obviously, with the Scottish Football Museum project, which, if I do nothing in the rest of my life, I'll rest content having built that.
And in terms of the latter, I mean, how can people access the museum? Is it a physical museum?
It is a physical museum at Hampden, so it's open 7 days a week. It's got its own website. You ship up and you wander around. Because of Scotland's preeminent position as the founders of modern world football, it has the best collection in the world by far. So because obviously I was responsible for laying it out all those years ago, you walked in and there was the Scottish Cup, the world's oldest continuously played for national competition. And then beyond it was my personal favourite, because I rediscovered it, the Glasgow Charity Cup from the 1870s, the second oldest major trophy in the world. And you're barely 10 feet into the museum. And that's the calibre of objects that the Scottish Football Museum has.
How did you get the job?
Do you know what? I was in the right place at the right time, because there were no national football museums in the world. So you couldn't go and get somebody to do the job who'd already done it. And museums are a very, very middle-class profession. And I don't think I ever met anybody who knew anything about football. So in 1989, I was asked by the then director of Glasgow Museums, Julian Spalding, who I'd befriended when he was the director of Manchester City Art Gallery, and I was a postgraduate student. That's how I came across him. And he said the SFA wanted somebody to try and work out whether there could be a museum of football. And he said, well, I don't know, but I know a man who does. And so I came up in 1990 to start inquiring as to whether we could have a museum and what on earth we could put in it. And it utterly, in the first few weeks, changed my life.
Because you discovered stuff that you didn't know existed.
Well, here's my road to Damascus, because I knew from living in England that England invented football. Very, 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 very simple. You look at any book, mob football on Shrove Tuesday, hundreds of people playing football. Then in 1863, the Football Association are founded by people from Eton and Harrow. Boom. That's it. Everything's done. And I'm sat in Queen's Park's offices looking at their albums, and they have photos of every team, plus many of the Scottish teams going back to the 1870s. And in the 1882 Scotland squad, at the back, stood there, was a black guy in a Scotland shirt. Now, everyone knows that Arthur Wharton of Preston North End is the world's first black footballer. And I believed that so much. I actually believed my eyes were lying to me as I was looking at this black footballer in a Scotland strip. But it taught me the thing which all historians are supposed to really know, which is be skeptical. Just because somebody said something or you're seeing something, don't believe until you've gone and checked it. So that was Andrew Watson of British Guiana. And over the following 10 years, I proved to myself and therefore the world that he was in fact the world's first, not only the world's first black footballer, the world's first black international footballer, the first black international captain, the first secretary of a club. And it was that moment where I thought, well, if this is wrong, then what else that I know can be wrong as well? And the answer, unfortunately, is pretty much everything. If you had interviewed me in 1989 and then brought me in now, I would be a very, very embarrassed football historian.
So we'll come back to Andrew Watson shortly, because it's such a fantastic story. It really is. I mean, it's almost deserving of 60 minutes on its own, but we don't have 60 minutes to devote to them. Maybe another time we will. What else did you come across that it really shook you?
Well, it was the sheer quality of the objects that were in the SFA stores and Queen's Park stores, because I knew that Queen's Park had been founded in 1867 and they were the oldest team in Scotland. And yes, it's a statistic, somebody had to be. And I looked at their collection of caps from old players, started researching the old players, and you start realizing, my God, the depth of history here. How do I not know it? Why aren't all these people and games in football history books? And to come back to the Glasgow Charity Cup, I knew of it by repute. I knew it was a trophy that had been invented in the 1870s so that the elite teams, particularly in the west of Scotland, could play one another in the days when there was no league. And I was scrabbling right round the back of the big store in Park Gardens where the SFA were, and there was a mahogany box. So I immediately knew there's something in here. I opened it up, and there it was in its constituent pieces, an utterly, utterly stunningly beautiful trophy. And I took it out and put it together. And I remember the great Bob Crampsey, by coincidence, phoned me just to chat a couple of weeks after and saying, what a shame, Jed, that the Glasgow Charity Cup has been lost for 30 years. And I was able to say, Bob, I've found it. And he was delighted, and I was delighted that he was impressed. But it was that level of quality that everywhere I went and everybody I met, you ended up, I went over to Edinburgh to talk to R.S. McCall's daughter. Now, R.S. McCall, Toffee Bob, the man who invented the R.S. McCall chain, one of the greatest footballers of all time, played up front for Scotland, scored a hat-trick against England, and she was very apologetic that really she had nothing except a kist. And she had it in her front room, and she opened it up, apologising, and there were his caps and his shirts from Scotland. And I nearly collapsed on the spot as she's still apologising to me that she's just got these things. Why? Because even though he was her father, she had no idea of his incredible importance for the world, because he was a Scotch professor who, when he went to Newcastle, gave them the passing and running game which Scotland invented and passed around the world. And it's hard for me to exaggerate the importance of and the genius of the Scots, particularly in the 19th century, who perfected the game that mistakenly everybody thinks is England's game.
Fascinating. We also talked earlier about, before the programme started, about the first international.
Oh, yeah.
Dispel some of the myths about the first international between England and Scotland.
Well, in 2022, it will be the 150th anniversary of the world's first international, and I have a great fear that, like all the history books, it will be taken over by England, pointing out that this is, you know, where they started football. But no one asks, why did Charles Alcock of what I will insist on calling the English Football Association, because it's the height of exceptionalism to call oneself the Football Association of where? Now, the Football Association had been founded in London in 1863 and was entirely ignored. Not that you would know that from the general history books. They had London teams, members of the Football Association in London, and in the north of England you had the oldest continuously running club in the world, the Sheffield FC, with their rules, with other teams playing them. So when the London Football Association tried to start throwing its weight about from 1863 onwards and taking over and extinguishing all types of other football, they didn't get far. And Charles Alcock clearly was a genius, no disrespect to him. He realised that if I'm in charge of the choosing of a national team squad to play Scotland, we must be the number one. But he wasn't strong enough to send up a team playing London Association rules. So the team that ended up at the West of Scotland Cricket Ground in Partick on St Andrew's Day 1872 had people playing the London rules, one Sheffield player, Clegg, playing Sheffield rules, Nottingham players playing Nottingham rules, Oxford players playing Oxford rules. And they all had to obviously play the London Association rules that day. But it's extraordinary. Nobody ever goes, hold on, that would be like the England team now having some rugby league players, some rugby union players, and maybe chucking in an Australian rules player to, ease the mix. He had to do that so that he could, in the long term, take control. But this is the law of unintended consequences, because Scotland, the intelligent, logical nation, had been playing a passing and running game for centuries, as far as I'm concerned, whereas England had played an individualistic public school, dribble the ball, get kicked, kick the ball, run after it. Imagine a playground game played by adults. So imagine the game kicks off. English player comes to kick a Scottish player. Scottish player kicks the ball away to another man. They must have thought, what in the name of God is he doing? This is ridiculous. Now they went back to England and it spread that the Scots were playing this logical passing and running game, which became known as the combination game. And every club that was set up in England instantly started getting what they called Scotch Professors, the people who thought intellectually about a scientific game. And every club worth a damn in England had to have between 1 and 11 Scotch Professors, or they were useless.
I'll tell you what's interesting to me is that here is this team from south of the border with all of these very varied codes being played by the players, and yet they managed to scramble a 0-0 draw. That's not a bad result.
It's not bad, because they did very, very badly in the decade after that. We're in the start of football where even in 1872 there are many codes, and we look now and we see a handling game in rugby and a kicking game in football, but in those days it was much, much closer. Even Queen's Park in the 1860s would come and go with teams to see if they could get a game going. But what the essential truth of Scottish football was, it was the passing and running game that won out, whereas England continued arguing throughout the 1860s and 1870s until they could get some sort of structure. And you had people playing union and people playing association. And Scotland just carried on serenely through, playing a passing and running game, which, as far as I'm concerned, goes back at least to the Reformation.
Really?
Well, here's the thing. Every general history book, it drives me nuts, has a picture of a Shrovetide football game in ye old medieval town with hundreds of guys chasing a ball. This has nothing whatsoever to do with 22 people playing the intelligent, logical Scottish game. Now, how do I know this? The Kirk records. Because when Scotland became Protestant, the Kirk had to remove all the last examples of popishness. So you had Christmas had to go, because that's not biblical. Football was seen as dodgy because it was something that was played regularly, at least every Sunday, before, during, or after football, because the Kirk records from all parts of Scotland have people being fined for succumbing to football on the Sabbath. Succumbing, it was like I wanted to not do it, but it got me. I'm sorry. And isn't it great? And it led me to an understanding. I had to search for what wasn't there, because what football historian would think, I'm going to look at the Kirk records? And so clearly on the nice flat graveyards with flat tombstones, or an area around every parish church, people played regularly. Now, if you play regularly, you have to have rules. There's no mob there, right? The mob football was an excuse to punch the guy down the street you didn't like. once or twice a year. This was regular football. It's no surprise that in the 1870s, when England started jousting with Scotland, Scotland had been practicing for 400 years. It was no surprise. They utterly rolled over the top of the individualistic concept of football that the public schools had.
Yeah, I gather some of the scores were 7-0, 7-1, 6. Is that right? I mean,
oh yes. I mean, you had at the end of the 1870s, you had Scotland winning by 6-1 away at the Kennington Oval, then winning 5-4, and then winning in 1882 5-1 at the First Hampden, the world's first purposely built international football ground. Because that's another thing. The Scots basically invented the idea of the sports stadium. But 1882 is the game that broke English hearts, because after 11 years, they had to admit they had no answer to the passing and running game, and that was the year they decided they would have to try and copy the Scotch Professor.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess a lot or much of this, and not all of it, will be in your book, your forthcoming book.
Well, yes. The great thing for me, but also the great difficulty for me, is I'm about to tear down every generally understood idea that people have, particularly people in other countries, about the way football was founded. Because unfortunately, Scotland being 1/10 the size of England and Scotland not really having an independent media, you go anywhere and everybody understands that football was founded by the English. And even worse, the idea there's such a thing as a Scot is, I'm afraid, not very well known. And I'll give you an anecdote, if I may. I'm showing a Brazilian tourist around the museum 20 years ago. And I'm showing him the medals of Archie MacLean of Paisley, who's one of the 2 or 3 people who went to Brazil and taught them how to play the Scotch Professor passing and running game. And I'm explaining to him, of course, he's one of the great Scottish players. And I can see him looking at me as if I'm simple. And I'm going, this is Glasgow in Scotland. And he's still looking at me, and it's almost like, what is this man talking about? He genuinely did not understand he was in another country. And of course, when Archie MacLean died in the 70s, lionized in Brazil, unknown in Scotland, the newspapers in Brazil have, Archie MacLean has died. The great English footballer from Paisley, Glasgow, near London, is dead.
Yeah.
Paisley, Glasgow, near London, which technically, I guess, is true.
Well, in the sense that you could argue that Rio de Janeiro is near Brasilia, but
yes, yes,
that would be stretching a point. So, what is Bombasto?
Sorry?
What is Bombasto?
Ah, yes. Okay. I'll repeat. I'm not interested in statistics. It's the truth of what goes on. So, yes, an Anglo-Scot who was brought up in Southampton called Charles Miller goes to Brazil and shows them the English way of playing, which was known as bombazo, the bomb. Get the ball, boot it forward, we all run after it like headless chickens. Okay, so the Brazilians took to that because football's good. And then people like Archie MacLean from Paisley goes to Sao Paulo where Miller is. Thomas Donahue goes to Rio de Janeiro to Bangu with the Scotch Professor game. The minute the Brazilians see this cool passing and running and moving, they call it the Tabelina style, the chart. And immediately the Bombazo style is dead, because they understand this is the football we want to play. Archie MacLean should have a statue 20 feet high in Scotland. It's really weird. The only statue out with the UK that I know of, a Scottish player, is Thomas Donahue, has got in Bangor, has got a statue of himself outside the fabric works where he worked as a master dyer. The only Scotch Professor statue is in Brazil, but still I see him sometimes referenced as English. So that's why we've got to keep pushing and change what people know, particularly people in South America who completely were taught how to play the game by Scots, particularly in Argentina, Uruguay and Brazil.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the John Harvey from Springbank, who I gather joined the Argentinian railway company, but was stolen by the Uruguayans. Is that correct?
So, how did the Scots get all over the place? It's not just the British Empire, it's the British commercial empire. So John Harley, who's a draftsman in the Springburn railway workshops, goes out to Argentina at first to work for the railway company in Bahia Blanca, ends up with the Ferrocarril Westi, the Western Railway Company of Buenos Aires, who of course have a football team because it's going to be packed with Scots who are out there working. Now, in 1908, he's playing for the team and they play the Central Uruguayan Railway Cricket Club, who come over from Montevideo, and they win. But they clock that there's this guy in midfield playing this astounding game where he is passing the ball and he's cool, calm and collected. So they do a quick friendly again in 1908 in Montevideo and basically poach him. Get him a nice job in the railway works in Peñarol in Montevideo, and he's there for 37 years. Peñarol becomes the name of CURCC because with all clubs, they normally lose their factory support at some stage. Peñarol is one of the greatest teams of all time. He shows Peñarol and a Uruguayan team, which he plays for 17 times, a Scotch Professor, playing 17 times for the Uruguayan team, shows them the passing and running game. They become the greatest footballing nation in the world, 3 million of them in the 1920s, win the Olympics, and in 1930, what I regard as a team of Scotch professors who happen to be Uruguayan, people who've learned how to play. They're all Uruguayan, they're all Spanish speaking, but it's the DNA of Scotland that is in their hearts and in their minds and in their boots. And they beat the other great Scotch Professor team, Argentina. They beat them 4-2 to win the first World Cup. And guess what? Third is the United States, with 5 Scotch Professors in their team, managed by Robert Miller from Paisley. So tell me again how England invented modern world football.
It's an extraordinary story. And I gather that John Harley ended up being called the Reformer.
Yes. In 1952, 45,000 people watching the Peñarol Rampla Juniors match, they stopped it so that all the great players from his time could give him a guard of honor, and he was officially named the Reformer, El Reformador, the reformer of Uruguayan football, i.e., yeah, we did understand football before, but it was that stupid kicking the ball up and down nonsense. I read recently he was also known as the maestro of maestros. Okay, so he wasn't just good. The brilliant footballers basically said he was the number one. Yeah. Now, That's extraordinary. If you walked out in the street, John, and said, John Harley of Springburn, I'm sure 99 people in 100 would go, I have no idea who you're talking about, and he's one of the greatest footballers of all time because he influenced an entire nation.
It's just extraordinary. And it's extraordinary, as you say, that so few people, I expect only a handful, know about him. I'll be talking to Stuart Cosgrave in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah.
And I hope we get a chance to talk about John Harley and as well as Andrew Watson. I'm interested in your world view of football.
Yeah.
I think in your view, and correct me here, you feel that the Scottish tradition is philosophical, whereas the English tradition is more empirical.
Yeah, the last thing football is about is 22 guys kicking a bag of air up and down a field. This is the first mistake people make. It's vastly more than that. So football holds up a mirror to the culture of a country. So it's no surprise that coming out of the English public schools, who are preparing people to run the empire, you have a sport where the emphasis is on individualism, because you're going to have to go out to Africa or India, and you're going to be the only white man who's going to show those people who we're superior to, you're going to show them that you are not frightened and you are better than them. So in football, if you kicked the ball away, that was a form of cowardice, because you were showing the individual skill and pluck. Now, even though Scotland was part of the empire, it's one of those, was it part of the empire, was it a colony? It's a very difficult discussion which will be teased out in the next 50 years. The Scots are a communitarian, thoughtful, philosophical country like Northern Europe, so they needed a theory. Scotland needed a theory, and so football had to be looked at theoretically. So whereas in England, if you practiced, you were a cheat because you were giving yourself an advantage over the next man. In Scotland, Queen's Park perfected moving up and down the pitch in pairs, which meant you had to know, where are you playing today? Where am I playing? Under what circumstances am I going to be passing to you? If you're passing to me, where should I be? So you have to think and plan. As far as I'm concerned, football is a logical consequence of the Enlightenment. So everyone goes on about Adam Smith and the foundation of economics. You look at people like Lord Kelvin pushing forward with scientific invention. Well, sport is just a logical invention. Scotland are the only country that could have taken the kicking of a ball and turned it into an international phenomenon. So everywhere you go in the world, if you're watching a football match, you're watching a small square of Scotland. Scotland didn't need to kill anyone. They didn't need to invade anyone. It was their intellectual prowess that persuaded countries like China, who'd been kicking a ball around for 2,000 years, that the Scottish game was the game that they should take on.
It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I want to move on to something which is less extraordinary and somewhat disappointing. It would be impossible, frankly, to talk about football in Scotland without talking about sectarianism.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe there's a better word for it. What's your view?
Well, the phrase anti-Irish sectarianism, anti-Irish racism would be more apposite, because that is what it is. And unfortunately, football, being the incredible social phenomenon it is, was latched onto. And many people who are listening to this will be thinking, Rangers. And I've seen people say Rangers, they were born sectarian. Actually, no, they weren't. But here's the thing. The world's oldest known football club is the Football Club, founded and run by John Hope of Edinburgh in 1824. Now, he brought young men together to play football, and at half-time he would lecture them on the twin dangers of drink and popery. So the idea that this is a new thing is wrong. And I also bring up the point, because we have to talk about Rangers. For 20 years, Rangers were a football team. In fact, in 1888, when Celtic played their first game, it was their pals from Rangers who provided the opposition, because lots of the Rangers lads and lots of the Celtic lads were like in the same athletics clubs. So it was no surprise. What happened was, very quickly, literally within a couple of years, Celtic go from nothing to being one of the biggest teams in the world. Now, they were about the 15th effort to found a team for the poor Irish. So it must have been a shock to watch on a Saturday thousands of people walking up the Gallowgate, many of them talking in a funny language which the decent Scot didn't understand. And here we have parallels with any group of immigrants. And they are supporting a team which is starting to lay waste to all the other Scottish clubs. And so the idea is they coalesce around Rangers and Sir John Ure Primrose, Lord Provost of Glasgow, and a staunch unionist, moves in and takes over Rangers and pledges them to Freemasonry and Orangism. And unfortunately, in a moral sense, it's downhill from there.
Yeah.
Now, we continue with this idea now, and more people are understanding it's just anti-Irish racism. It's not something where you can go, the phrase I hate, both sides are as bad as one another. No, actually, no. That's not the case at all. And I'm happy. I've heard sectarian chanting at Celtic Park, but it will be, gosh, last time I heard it 10, 15 years ago. A lot of people mistake Republican songs for sectarian songs, which would need them to explain to me Brave Protestant Men, for example, sung by Celtic fans. Now, it's an issue that we ultimately need to have an intelligent talk about, and I think it's possible, because to say that Rangers fans are all anti-Irish bigots is ridiculous, because I don't believe that of people. And I've had my personal communications with people who write for Rangers who have disagreed with me greatly, and I've thought they were decent people who I disagreed with. Yeah. And we're going to end up, I think, if independence comes, the culture of Scotland will continue to grow and progress. Glasgow in particular, Edinburgh, they're multi-ethnic cities now. It's becoming irrelevant, although it's still there. And I have a pal who is a West Indian Asian whose family moved here some years ago. And this isn't a friend of a friend's girlfriend's taxi driver told me. She told me herself, she was once asked, "What are you?" She said, "I'm a Hindu." "Yes, but are you a Catholic Hindu or a Protestant Hindu?" Which had her completely stunned, because where do you go with that question?
Yeah. But I think it's helpful to avoid euphemisms. As you say, it's racism, and that it seems to me it's useful to use the terms that are appropriate rather than look for soft soaping. We've had a couple of 3 questions. I think Billy Holland's question on Facebook, I think you've probably covered it. He's asking, is Scottish football not just another tool to control the political agenda for the British state? I think you've rather scotched that, if you'll excuse me.
Well, but it is important because one of the issues that all empires have is exceptionalism. America is going through it now. Rome went through it 1700 years ago, where if you go, all rules do not apply to us because of who we are, when you become weaker and all empires fall, you suddenly find that your reason for existence, you've lost it. And this is why I expect to have many issues if people start engaging with me, because I'm basically saying the history of football is a history of Scotland. It's a history of a country which is entirely and utterly separate, different, not superior, just different. Now, Belgium, when they lost their empire, had to go through looking at themselves as to who they were. Obviously, Germany in 1945 were forced to look at themselves and come up with a new way of living. Yeah. Now, we're having to do that. Both Scotland and England are having to come up. I think today, did I not read that 50% of people in England would like England and Scotland to be independently separate?
Yeah, I mentioned that at the beginning.
So it's something that's coming. It's just a thing. So football, I'm afraid, is going to have to rebalance itself. Yeah. And we're going to have to help people understand how it was the Scotch Professor moving to England and the DNA of Scottish sport completely and utterly permeated and took over. It was a conceptual and ideological victory, a great one, because we all love football. Yeah. And hopefully England comes to an accommodation with itself and is happy with itself in the same way as I'd like Scotland to be happy in itself. That's
a good point. Another question from Lenny Harry on YouTube. And I think you may well have addressed this too, Jed, but here goes. How was the Scottish influence forgotten by we Scots? How did that happen?
Well, first off, I'm going to be pedantic. To forget your influence, you first have to have remembered it, okay? And from the 1870s, Charles Alcock of what I would call the London Football Association, that became the English Football Association, started writing the history of 19th century football. And he did a bang-up job for 40 years until he died in, I think, 1906. And others took up the cudgels so that even Scotland forgot its own game. And I'll give you the terrible example. First European away game Scotland played was against Austria, the wonder team. Guess what? Influenced by people like Johnny Madden, who had gone over to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and taught Slavia Prague. John Tate Robertson of Rangers, who went to MTK Budapest and spread the passing and running game around Central Europe. They come back to play a couple of years later in the early 30s. Austria play Scotland, and people are amazed at the fast-running, sharp passing and dribbling game that the Wunder team of Austria play. The old guys in the crowd are going, why are we getting surprised? This is the game we played 50 years ago. But the young'uns in the 1930s thought they were looking at something new and foreign, and it was people like Johnny Madden and John Tate Robertson who had given Europe the game that Scotland had invented.
That's fantastic. Great. I mean, and hopefully, Lenny, that has answered your question. A very comprehensive answer, and a really interesting one. We really, I don't want us to run out of time before we talk about Andrew Watson.
Yes.
Because and if you can, I know you've been talking with others perhaps about a statue to Andrew and maybe a memorial trophy of some kind. Tell us about those ideas, please.
Yes. Well, I and a couple of my pals, Graham Watson of Hampden Bowling Club, Graham Brown of Hampden Bowling Club, who discovered where the first Hampden was on the site of Hampden Bowling Club. He was instrumental in getting the money for a mural for Andrew Watson on the back wall facing the railway line, the pair of us and Tam McNabb. And that's the only memorial to Andrew Watson, who was the son of Peter Miller Watson from Orkney, who had gone over to run the family plantations in Demerara, British Guiana. Had 2 children, Andrew in 1856 and Anna, brought them back to the UK, where normally you've had your fun and you leave your offspring there. Now, he brought them back. Peter Miller Watson then died in 1869 when Andrew was 13 and left him a very wealthy young man. He went to Glasgow University, studied under Lord Kelvin. So you're looking at a seriously intelligent, mixed-race Scot. Starts playing for first Maxwell FC, then Park Grove in the 1870s, is seen by Queen's Park Football Club, who then are the most important football club in the world. They are the most important football club in the world, even though 500 people watch them now. And clearly, if you're playing for Queen's Park, you're in the Scotland team. And he's captain in his first of 3 games for Scotland. Captain. A black man playing either right side or centre mid is the captain. England 1, Scotland 6. Right. Now that's a start. In 1882, the game which broke English hearts, where they decided they had to give up trying to play this ridiculous dribbling game, he's also in it. By the way, he only gets 3 caps because he moves to England. And at the time, the SFA wouldn't play English-based Scots. Now, here's the thing. Pa Jackson of the English Football Association decides he needs to do something about it. So March the 11th, he watches England get torn to pieces. And about 4 months later, he sets up a team called the Corinthians to learn how to play and practice this game that Scotland have created. And he's going to bring together the elite of the amateur game in England and try and get them into the England team. What does he do? 1884, they travel around on a tour, Yorkshire and Lancashire, and they invite Andrew Watson to come down. Remember, this is a team for the English amateur elite, and they ask a black Scotsman to play with them. He plays in the 8-1 killing of Blackburn Rovers, who at that time were the English FA Cup winners. And they have a Scotch Professor playing for them. Are you going to see this mentioned in history books? You're going to be looking a long time for it, because it blows utterly apart the idea that England invented football. Because if it was English football, why did you need people like Andrew Watson? Everywhere he went, he trained to be a marine engineer in Liverpool. Bootle asked him to play for them. This was at a time when the 2 big teams in Liverpool were Bootle and Everton. And there's strong rumours that he was paid, which would make him the first professional footballer. And by the way, do you want a nice piece of racism here? The English FA was fighting like mad against professionalism. Why did professionalism come in? if you're persuading someone like Fergie Souter to come down from Glasgow and play for Darwin, you're going to need to pay him, right? He's not coming down to live in the balmy climate of East Lancashire. So they invented a rule. You couldn't play in the English FA Cup if you hadn't been living for a certain number of years and you definitely were an amateur. Guess what? Only Scots were affected by this. And all the Lancashire teams went, do you know what? We're going to leave. If you insist on this, you're going to leave. Burnley actually said, when we played an all-English team, nobody came to see us. And when we got in Scotch Professors, everybody came to see us. And in the end, Preston North End, proud Preston, went, yeah, we're playing Scotch Professors and we're paying them. What you going to do about it? If you throw us out, great. We'll found a new association. And we'll have our Scotch Professors. And it's extraordinary, the influence, and it's even more extraordinary how it's been utterly buried.
Yeah.
I'll finish on Merseyside for this. 1892, Everton are thrown out of Anfield, which will surprise most people who think that Liverpool play at Anfield. So the owner of Anfield was left with a ground with no football. Solution? Get his man, the Irish manager Aberkenna, get him up to Glasgow. He buys an entire team of Scotch Professors, brings them down. They found a team. They tried to call it Everton Athletic and are told to get lost. Puts them into the Lancashire League. They win it, get straight into the second division. They're known as the team of the Macs because all 11 of them are Scots. Like Sunderland, the team of all the talents. They win the World Championship in 1895 against Hearts. 11 Scots playing for Hearts versus 11 Scotch Professors playing for Sunderland. Now, they're the stories which are well known, but I'm going to bring them together.
Excellent.
And explain why Scottish culture is unparalleled in sporting history.
Now, two quick questions, and they both relate to that. One is a specific. Rab Mackenzie on Facebook asks, is there anything in the museum about Hibs' famous five?
Yes, there is. Now, remember, my point, John, is I'm looking at incredible influences, okay? And now, remember, I've been away from the museum for quite a while, but I know that they had stuff on display from Laurie Riley. Now, we're now talking about the 1950s. I remember Laurie Riley saying to me, Jed, why do we used to play European Cup games on a Wednesday? And I'm going, I don't know, because why would you play on a Wednesday, a Saturday, a Monday? Who cares? And he says, well, we were one of the founders of the European Cup, Hibs. And it was half-day closing in Edinburgh on a Wednesday. And we had no floodlights. So you couldn't play at night. So we played games on a Wednesday afternoon. And so he said, so Hibs, pioneers of European football, helped decide what day that European football will be played on. Now,
that's amazing. You know, I know lots of Hibs fans, including my son. I suspect he doesn't know that. That'll be a gem. I'll save that up if I may. Again, we've been asked, when is your book out? People are interested. They're interested in your book. They want to know when it's going to be published.
Well, no, I'm hoping it will be published in no more than a year's time. But obviously, I'm doing it whilst I'm teaching. COVID-19 has weirdly been good to me because I can concentrate here doing it. I don't know whether I'll have a publisher who wants to take it because it's rather inflammatory, of course, because I'm saying everything you know is wrong. I might crowdfund it. I will see where we go, and it's only what I've said to you, John, today is a tiny, tiny portion
exactly
of what I know, which is a tiny portion of what anyone knows. And I'm happy for 90% of what I say to you to be proved wrong within 10 years, because it means we'll have moved on. But the core truth is the Scotch Professor invented modern world football.
A few people are asking, how can we follow Jed?
Well,
how can we know more about his book?
Please go on to Twitter. I'm Jedboy58, Gedboy 58. Every morning at 5:05, I will put up a set of normally 4, 5, or 6 tweets, which will tell you a particular thing that happened in football to prove football's preeminence, and follow me.
Excellent. Well, there you are, folks. I mean, you couldn't have wished for a better invitation than that. I mean, it's just extraordinary. We're almost through. Is there any last particular short thought that you would like to offer the folks who are watching and listening?
Question everything. Be utterly proud of where you live and the football that's played in your area. And if you see or think of anything which you think, I don't need to tell anyone, no, please, it's important, and get in touch with me and tell me the little thing that you know which I can add, particularly if it's from the 19th century.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Jed, we're almost out of time. This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm no BS. I can tell you that I suspect we've literally scratched the surface. That's my feeling.
Yes.
And I'm really looking forward to the book. And I suspect everyone who's in the audience tonight will feel likewise. Well, our time is almost up, folks. A big thanks to Jed. Do look out for his new book when it arrives. It's called How Scotland Invented Modern Football. Isn't that right?
How Scotland invented modern world football. Yes.
Football. World football. Well, that was football. An important qualifier.
Not just football, world football.
Excellent. And a big thank you to all of you for watching and for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the TNT show. Again, we have another formidable guest next week. Ruth Watson joins us, and she'll tell us all about Scotland, the brand, and why it really matters to you. So don't miss the show. Join us next week at 7 for The Nation Talks. Oh yes, and look out for the Constitution column, because it's directly linked to some of the points that Jed was making tonight about the end of empire. In fact, the column begins by talking about the end of empire. So there's a nice connection there between Jed's remarks and the column on Sunday. Don't miss that too. And also, as I always say, very importantly, please support Indie Live. The details are available on the screen. If you've enjoyed the show, then they could use your support. There's a lot of work goes on behind the scenes. It's so much that I couldn't even begin to tell you. But suffice to know, if you're looking for a different sort of news, and I know many of you are, this is the place to come. You would never have heard an interview like this on the so-called conventional channels, believe me. And support Indie Live. And last but by no means least, thank you again for joining us. And remember, it's a great day for democracy. Good night, all.
Hi, Dr. Dave here. Join me for the Dr. Dave Show, Wednesday night, 9 o'clock, with repeats early Friday morning and 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Music, views, your requests and your comments. A great bit of fun and banter. Join me on indylive.radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackmannan Show Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on Indie Live Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. Be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at Indie Live Radio.
Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on Indie Live Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on Indie Live Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, this is Marley and I'm here to tell you a bit about Daytime Live Show, which goes out Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays on Indie Live Radio at 11:30 for a couple of hours. So I present the programme along with Val, and we're there with a variety of guests to chat to each day. Now, at the moment, Wednesday's show is a catch-up edition. It's not live. What we do is we rebroadcast some of the more recent interviews. So we hope we enjoy all of those. Be there at 11:30 on Indie Live Radio for the news you don't hear elsewhere. A new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, James E here from the Saturday Show on indylive.radio. We play a wide selection and wide genre of music for your entertainment. We're on Saturday mornings from 10 till 1 p.m. Remember, join us on indylive.radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
You can watch this again, you can be part of it. It's Independence Live. YouTube.com/Independence Live. That's where you'll find it.
No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But therefore I'll be your slave. I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, one more. Oh, freedom over me, but before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.